So we've been talking about the pre-Socratics, and the pre-Socratic philosophers, by their name, of course, means prior to Socrates. And so obviously Socrates is an extremely important figure in ancient philosophy because we've had all these other pre-Socratic philosophers, and their name derives from Socrates himself. So Socrates is really important. However, Socrates didn't write anything down. So Plato, one of his most famous students, was the one who wrote things down. So what we have from Socrates, we're actually getting from Plato. And what that means is that some of the writings of Plato are historically accurate, we can presume. They are actual descriptions of what Socrates said and the interactions that he had. However, some of the later writings of Plato, we have good indications, starting with Aristotle, that that was not Socrates so much as it was Plato himself. And so we have the Apology, the Euthyphro, the Crito. Those books are called the early works, and those we can presume were fairly historically accurate in terms of getting the ideas and the words of Socrates. The later writings, and we'll spend a lot of time with the Republic, which is somewhat later, we can presume are Plato's own ideas. But I want to talk about Socrates just a little bit. One of the tools that Socrates uses is the Socratic Question, where he asks questions instead of trying to give answers. And Socrates was very interested in things like virtue and justice and courage and wisdom and love and friendship and what those things meant. And so he would go around Athens and he would ask people, what's the nature of justice? What is it to be just? And when people would give an answer, he would challenge them and say, well, wait a minute. If that's the answer, we have this problem with your definition. So just a quick example with justice. We see that in the first part of the Republic, that's the topic, and Socrates asks, what's justice? And one of the answers is, well, giving others what they're due. Seems like a dictionary definition that's perfectly fine. But Socrates says, well, wait a minute. So do you mean if I've borrowed something from someone and then they want it back, the just thing to do is to give it back? And the person says, sure, right, you've got it. And Socrates says, well, what about in the situation where I've borrowed a large knife from a neighbor? And then he comes over late at night and he says, give me that knife. I'm going to kill my wife. Is it a just thing to return the knife? And Socrates says no, and the person he's interacting with would say no. And so he says, well, we don't have the right definition of justice. And it would go on like this, and people would become frustrated because they would find that they really don't have a good definition for these big, important ideas that Socrates was interested in. So Socrates didn't really provide his own definitions. We see that Plato does that when we get into the writings of Plato. But I do want to mention some of the things that we call Socratic Doctrines. This is from the textbook, the editors of the textbook. They identify 4 Socratic Doctrines. And briefly, one of those is the idea that virtue is the key to happiness. So if you want to live a happy life and a good life, you should be virtuous. Speaking of virtue, then, a second Socratic doctrine is the idea that wisdom is the key to virtue. So for all virtues, wisdom is necessary. You have to have wisdom in order to have that particular virtue. A third Socratic doctrine is what I call acrasia is impossible. Now, acrasia means weakness of the will or doing what you don't think is the right thing. Socrates says everyone always does what they consider to be the best thing. And we'll see that in various places as we go through the text. And then finally, a very important doctrine of Socrates that we will see very early is the idea that it's better to suffer injustice than to inflict injustice. So you're better off being on the receiving end of injustice than causing an injustice. So those are the four Socratic doctrines, and we'll see how those play out